All right, so let's move on from our effect slots and go to the LFOs. Each track has 3 LFOs that can be routed to different destinations. We also have an LFO designer where we can create our own LFO waveform. Each track has a separate LFO designer, and you can design an LFO shape for each track that can be utilized on any other track. If we look over here, those are the 6 different parameters for the LFOs that we can affect. So we have the parameter that will be affected here. And next to that, we have the waveform. And if I scroll through this, we have various waveforms to use. But eventually, we'll get to the point where it says T1. So that would be the LFO that was designed for track 1. I haven't designed one for track 1, so we don't see anything there. But just to reiterate that point, all the different LFOs we designed for the various tracks can be used on all the other tracks. Now, let's just hear how the LFO will affect something before we actually design our own little waveform. So I'm going to focus on the drums on track 8. I'm going to go ahead and mute the hi-hat, and I'm going to mute track 1. On track 8, we have that distortion, the lo-fi effect that's being applied. So I think I want to have the LFO affect one of those parameters. So as I'm adjusting this knob for parameter, any parameter that's available in any of these 5 pages can be modulated by the LFO. And there we go. All right. So the distortion amount is here. Now we have a multiplier, and this will basically multiply the speed, which is here. And if I press N, I can see the value. It's set to 32. So let me go ahead and increase the depth, and let's just hear how this affects the distortion. So we heard it increase eventually. All right. So at a speed of 32, this is operating relatively slowly. So I'm going to use my multiplier, and I'm going to set this to ×4. Okay, so now we can hear that the waveform, we're cycling through this waveform every single bar. When the trig mode is set to free, the LFO is just going to freely cycle in the background. And whenever we start the music or we play a certain trig, the LFO is not going to start over. It's not going to be re-triggered when we trigger a note. If you hear the way the LFO is affecting the distortion now, if I stop this and then I play it again, it's not affecting the same part of the sequence it was affecting before because it's running in a free sync mode. If we change the trig to trig right there, every time a note is triggered, the LFO is going to be re-triggered. It'll start at the beginning of the phase of whatever wave cycle that we're currently using. Since we're now using this triangle waveform, the triangle starts in the middle, so we're never really going to hear this sound affected. If we go to a different waveform, when it starts at a higher value, all right, there we go. So trig, every time a note is played, is triggering the beginning of this wave cycle, and this particular wave cycle starts at the maximum value. If I change this to hold, and let me just go back to my triangle here, the hold setting will make it so that every time a note is triggered, the LFO will affect that certain parameter, but it's not going to cycle as the note plays. Basically, whatever position the LFO was at will be held as that particular note is held. So you won't hear the parameter move as the steps play. So if I play this, and let's make the multiplier a little bit slower. It's a little bit hard to hear with this. If we had something that was sustaining, you'd probably be able to hear it a little bit better. But that's the difference between using hold and trig or free. Let me go ahead and just, make sure we keep that on the same place. And we have a few different options here. One is just going to cycle through the LFO wave cycle once. And half is going to cycle through the first half of the LFO wave cycle. So for example, we have this triangle that's going up and going down. We basically start at the beginning, go up, and then go to the 180-degree phase point, the midpoint of the wave cycle. And then we have sync trig. So now the LFO is going to be synced to our tempo. And every time we play it, we're going to get the same movement happening. Now I'm going to leave it on sync trig. And what I'd like to do is basically design an LFO that is going to modulate the distortion amount. Let me go down here to the designer. So looking at the LFO designer, there's 16 different steps that I can put into this waveform. And I can enter them by simply holding down one of the steps in the sequencer. So for instance, this first one. And now these 4 knobs up here will allow me to adjust the value of this step and the neighboring steps. So for example, I'm going to adjust this one up like so. Now while I'm holding this first step, if I adjust the B knob, that's going to adjust the step next to it. If I adjust the C knob, that'll adjust the step next to that one. Another way that I could adjust multiple steps is I could simply hold several steps down like this. We can see there's a little line there in the LFO setup letting me know which ones will get adjusted. And if I adjust the knob like this, it adjusts them all at once. So get creative here, do some unique stuff. Just going to make a very bizarre shape and see what happens. Now we can see that the LFO here is stepped. There's sudden jumps in value. There's no interpolation between the different values. If I want to add interpolation so that I can have nice curves instead of just having it jump in steps, I can simply just hold down one of these steps and press the tempo button. So now there's a curved line there. So I'm going to make it so that instead of this jumping like this, I'm going to just interpolate all the values here. So now, instead of having those jagged steps, I have nice curved lines. So let me go back up to LFO1, which I've assigned to the distortion amount, and I'm going to change the waveform from this to the one I've designed for this particular track. So let me keep scrolling, 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 scrolling. Track 8. So now I can see there's a shape there, and this is the shape that I designed. Let's hear how this sounds as it affects the distortion amount. Let me actually slow the multiplier down. So now we can hear how it's affecting certain steps. Let me go ahead and bring the hi-hat back in. Let me turn this track up a little bit. All right. Now, again, like I said, each track has 3 different LFOs. When I leave the LFO setup page, let me go back to track 8. I can see the first LFO that I use, there's the speed amount and there's the depth. So I don't have to go into the setup page in order to control the speed and the depth. I can affect all 3 of the LFOs from here. And the fact that we can access those parameters here means that these can also be parameter locked to different steps in our sequencer.